Have you ever thought you understood a concept perfectly and then bam, one single profound experience just shatters your entire preconceived worldview?
Oh, yeah. It is a truly humbling experience when that happens. It just kind of pulls the rug out from under you.
Right. And that is exactly our mission for this deep dive today. We are looking at a really fascinating theological lecture from the YouTube channel Kenosis, specifically Lecture 125, which focuses on the Acts of the Apostles and the Pauline epistles.
It's a massive, incredibly dense lecture. I mean,
True.
really. But it forces us to confront what actually happens when abstract religious ideas violently collide with raw, unfiltered personal experience.
Exactly. And it just completely reframes how we understand fairness, success, and community. And
Mhm.
for you, the listener, honestly, whether you consider yourself deeply religious or you're just insanely curious about philosophy and human societal structures, this is going to give you a totally fresh lens on the concepts of merit and destiny.
It absolutely will,
Right.
because it challenges the very foundation of how we justify our own success. It's a tough pill to swallow, actually.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because before we can even talk about like the nature of God or the law of the spirit, we have to establish how the source material says we should even study these things, right? Because there is this huge distinction drawn between philosophy and theology.
Right, so the speaker makes a very sharp point here. Philosophy is something you can do at a desk. You can sit in a comfortable lecture hall, read ancient texts, and just use rational argument to figure things out.
Like a purely intellectual
Uh,
exercise. You're just thinking your way to a worldview.
yes, exactly. You just use your intellect. But theology, at least in this specific framework, requires actual personal spiritual experience. Without that direct experience, the source argues that theology isn't theology anymore. It just devolves back into philosophy.
So it's just copying and pasting other people's ideas at that point.
Pretty much, yeah. You're just rearranging quotes and convincing yourself that you understand a reality you've never actually touched.
Wow. So it's basically like trying to write a comprehensive, definitive guidebook on how to swim, but you've only ever sat on the edge of the pool reading about buoyancy and fluid dynamics?
That is a perfect analogy. You might know the complete history of the backstroke, but
Okay.
you've never actually gotten wet.
Right, right.
And there's actually a wild story the speaker shares about a prominent Korean systematic theologian to illustrate this. This guy studied in Germany, and he wrote this massive 1,000-page, two-volume masterwork.
Okay. 1,000 pages is a lot of theology.
It is. But when it was published, people realized there was this glaring omission. He completely left out pneumatology.
Wait, really? The study of the Holy Spirit.
Exactly. Which, in Christian theology, leaving the Holy Spirit out of a systematic textbook is almost unthinkable. It's a huge deal.
So why did he leave it out?
When asked about it, he honestly admitted that he lacked the deep, visceral, personal experience required to write about it truthfully. He just refused to fake it.
Oh, wow. I mean, it requires a rare level of intellectual humility to reach the absolute pinnacle of your academic field and still say, like, I know the vocabulary, but I don't actually know the reality.
Yeah, and the source notes this isn't an isolated incident either. Several famous Western philosophers originally started their careers in theology, but they actually switched over to pure philosophy.
Because they felt unqualified.
Exactly. They felt they lacked the necessary spiritual experience. So they moved to a field where, their intellect alone was the only required tool.
That is fascinating. So if lived experience is the absolute non-negotiable entry fee for theology, we have to ask, what happens when someone actually crosses that threshold? What does that raw encounter actually look like?
Well, the source details the speaker's own account of a face-to-face encounter with God. And to be clear, this isn't like a physical meeting with a guy in the clouds.
Right, not a literal face.
No, it's described as a state of absolute overwhelming presence. In this state, thoughts and emotions are transmitted perfectly and instantly, completely bypassing the clumsy vehicle of human language.
Which is huge because language is incredibly limiting when you think about it. Like if I say I'm experiencing sadness, that could mean I just finished a bittersweet movie, or it could mean I am navigating the deepest, most devastating grief of my entire life.
Yeah, we really only have a handful of words to describe a million different shades of emotion. But in this face-to-face state, that limitation just vanishes. The exact intensity of an emotion is perfectly understood telepathically. There is zero room for ambiguity.
Stripped of all linguistic defenses, that kind of pure transmission sounds terrifying, honestly.
You'd be incredibly intense. But here is the big reveal from the source. The most staggering realization for the speaker wasn't feeling this sudden wave of unconditional love or endless grace. The overwhelming revelation was encountering God as absolute law.
Law, like legal rules.
Specifically, the unyielding law of cause and effect. The realization was that nature's absolute laws, like gravity, are direct mirrors of divine fairness. The source uses a classic Korean proverb to explain it. Plant beans, get beans. Plant red beans, get red beans.
The ultimate expression of input equals output.
Exactly. In this framework, God isn't a separate entity managing cause and effect from afar. God is the ultimate embodiment of that fairness.
Wait, here's where it gets really interesting, though, because isn't the whole point of modern Christianity an emphasis on endless grace and unconditional love, like the prodigal son being embraced no matter what? If the ultimate divine reality is just a strict ledger of inputs and outputs, a cold, mechanical, plant beans, get beans universe, how is it any different from a machine? How do you reconcile a God of absolute law with a God of love?
That is the natural pushback, right? But the source argues we've created a false dichotomy. The speaker explains that love without fairness is actually a logical contradiction.
Walk me through that. How does love require strict fairness?
Okay, imagine a courtroom. You have a judge who is so overwhelmed by a sense of pity and, love for the perpetrators that he simply lets everyone off the hook. He forgives every violent crime, every theft, instantly, out of mercy.
I see where this is going.
Right. By showing unearned mercy to the perpetrator, that judge is actively destroying fairness for the victims. A love that ignores justice isn't love at all. It's just chaos. So true divine love must be inextricably linked to absolute fairness and cause and effect.
Man, that is a huge paradigm shift. Because if the universe requires absolute fairness and strict cause and effect to function morally, then the idea of a predetermined destiny completely falls apart, right? If every action must have a fair consequence, the script cannot be written before the actors even take the stage.
It completely dismantles the concept of predestination, or what we call determinism. And the speaker originally believed in predestination, actually, because his own religious conversion felt so miraculous, he assumed it had to be pre-planned.
Sure, it's a very common human tendency. It feels incredible to believe the universe specifically singled you out.
Oh, it's a massive stroke to the ego. But his experience of God as fairness shattered that.
Yeah.
Because if you follow predestination to its logical conclusion, you hit a terrifying wall. If God predetermines who is saved, who is doomed, who is born wildly wealthy, and who is destined to suffer in crushing poverty,
Then God becomes an arbitrary, cruel dictator.
exactly. If the game is rigged before you even sit down at the table, how could you possibly be judged fairly on how you play your hand? You can't.
That makes perfect sense.
And this is exactly why the source explains the historical biblical condemnation of shamans and fortune tellers. It's easy to dismiss that stuff as ancient superstition, but the root issue is profoundly philosophical.
Because fortune-telling is fundamentally an attack on human agency.
Yes, fortune telling, whether reading palm lines or predicting someone is burned to be rich, promotes a fixed destiny. If destiny is fixed, your choices don't matter. Human agency is dead. And if human agency is dead, fair judgment is literally impossible.
You're just punishing a puppet for the strings pulled by the puppeteer. But wait, if fortune-telling is condemned because predicting a fixed future destroys agency, we have to look at the prophets, right? Biblical texts are filled with prophets seemingly predicting the future, telling kings their empires will fall. How is that functionally any different from reading a poem?
That's a great question, and the source clarifies this beautifully. We completely misunderstand prophecy when we equate it with a crystal ball. Biblical prophecy is categorically not fortune-telling.
Okay, so what is it then?
Prophecy is about setting a direction. When the prophets warned Israel, your nation will be ruined, they were not announcing an unavoidable fate. They were declaring, look at your current actions. If you keep breaking the contract, you will be ruined. It was a warning meant to change behavior.
So what does this all mean? It sounds like a prophet isn't a movie projector playing a pre-recorded unavoidable ending that humanity just has to sit back and watch. They are more like a GPS system warning you that your current speed and trajectory are leading you straight off a cliff, giving you the chance to hit the brakes.
That's exactly it. The entire purpose of the prophecy is to trigger human agency, not suppress it. The speaker uses the example of a teacher. If a teacher tells a misbehaving student they are destined to be a criminal, they are acting like a fortune teller, and they're a terrible teacher.
Because it locks them into a fate.
Right. The goal is to say, if you keep making these choices, you're going to ruin your future, so that they are empowered to alter their outcome.
Prophecy is an invitation to change course. I love that. So, okay, if we accept that destiny isn't fixed and the universe operates on strict cause and effect, our choices matter deeply. But this leads us into a massive psychological trap.
The meritocracy trap.
Yes. Because if my choices matter and I work incredibly hard and I build a wildly successful life, isn't that success entirely my own merit? Do I not have the right to call myself entirely self-made?
And this is where the concept of absolute meritocracy begins to completely unravel. The source points out that while the law of cause and effect guarantees that your effort matters, claiming absolute personal merit ignores all the foundational elements of your life that you did absolutely nothing to earn.
The given factors, like I didn't buy my intelligence.
Exactly. You did not earn your baseline intelligence. You didn't earn your physical health, your genetic predispositions, or the stable environment you were born into. Claiming absolute personal merit for your success completely ignores these massive compounding advantages handed to you at birth.
It's like playing a complex video game on story mode, where you are given extra health and unlimited resources while entirely believing you are setting world record high scores on hard mode. You are confusing the game's given settings with your own personal skill.
That's a great way to put it. And the source notes that the Apostle Paul argued aggressively against this kind of merit-based arrogance. He pushed back against factions who believed they could earn salvation through rigid adherence to Sabbath laws, which had just morphed into a way for people to display merit badges.
They were trying to manufacture merit to prove they were superior. So how does this theological critique of merit actually translate into the physical, economic world?
The source applies this directly to the Old Testament concept of first fruits and tithes.
Mm-hmm.
Bringing 10% of your wealth or your first harvest is so often misinterpreted today as, mailing money to heaven.
Right, like appeasing a demanding deity.
Yeah, but in its original context, it was a highly sophisticated community survival mechanism. Think about an ancient agricultural community. The farmer who works diligently will generally see a good yield because of cause and effect. But success is never fully guaranteed because of those unpredictable given factors.
Right, a localized blight might sweep through one side of the valley, or the rain might fall unevenly. Some farmers are going to face catastrophic failure through absolutely no fault of their own. They planted the beans, but a swarm of locusts ate the beans.
Exactly. So the religious law mandated that the farmer whose crops flourished had to bring their surplus so that the farmer whose crops failed wouldn't starve. The tithe was an ancient, community-funded social safety net.
But wait, if we just take the surplus from the highly successful individuals and redistribute it to everyone who fails, aren't we just talking about communism? Doesn't that kill the motivation to work hard? Why break your back in the hot sun if the community is just going to take the extra grain and give it away?
The source provides a brilliant counter to this, and it comes down to the underlying psychological motivation. Under communism, forced equal distribution does destroy the will to work because it relies on state coercion.
Coercion breeds resentment. You just do the bare minimum.
Right. But in this religious framework, you aren't sharing because a totalitarian government has a spear to your back. You are motivated to work as hard as you can, specifically to generate a surplus to save your neighbor, because you have a deep, terrifying understanding of your own vulnerability.
Oh, wow. It requires radical empathy born out of self-awareness.
Yeah, exactly. You look at the blighted field next to yours and you realize that next year, your crops might be the ones that fail.
Yeah.
Or, perhaps most motivating of all, your children might be the ones who struggle and lack those innate advantages.
That completely removes the ego from the equation of success. You work tirelessly because you know the community is the only thing that will catch you when your own luck inevitably runs out.
It forces a total reevaluation of what our innate talents actually represent. We have to stop looking at our high intelligence, our physical stamina, or our inherited wealth as personal merits to brag about.
The paradigm shift here is profound. Let's recap this, because we started by learning that you can't just read about theology, you have to experience it. And that raw experience revealed a God of absolute fairness and cause and effect, which shatters the idea of a fixed destiny or fortune telling.
Right, it demands that we take responsibility for our actions, but simultaneously strips away the arrogance of the self-made individual.
And it connects directly back to you, the listener. It completely reframes how we look at our own advantages. Your intelligence, your good health, or your stable upbringing aren't merits to brag about.
Yeah, they aren't. They are missions given to you.
Yeah.
The surplus you generate using those unearned advantages actually belongs to the deficit of your neighbor who wasn't given those same tools.
which is just a demanding, uncomfortable level of humility. And it leaves us with a tremendous amount to chew on. As you go about the rest of your day, I want you to think about this. If we truly stopped viewing our innate talents and environmental luck as personal merit, and instead viewed them strictly as missions meant to be deployed for others, how would that completely change the way we evaluate and reward the most celebrated, successful people in our modern society?
What would the world look like if billionaires were viewed not as the ultimate winners of the meritocracy, but as the individuals burdened with the heaviest, most urgent missions to solve the deficits of others? It fundamentally challenges how a society measures human worth.
It certainly does. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the structures around you, and we'll catch you next time.